The flash of red and blue lights cut through the morning mist like broken glass, casting eerie shadows across the pasture where my 12-year-old daughter Emma knelt beside our old mare, Buttercup. Her small hands trembled as she offered carrots to the horse, the same ritual she'd performed every morning since my father's funeral 3 weeks ago. The sound of car doors slamming echoed across the valley with the finality of a gavel striking wood. "Step away from the animal. Young lady." Officer Martinez's voice cracked like a whip across the silence. Emma's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror, as two uniformed officers approached the fence line. Behind them, a woman in a crisp burgundy blazer stood with her arms crossed, her platinum blonde hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. Patricia Harrington, or, as the neighbors had taken to calling her, HOA. Karen watched with satisfaction as my daughter scrambled to her feet. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the morning wind that rustled through the oak trees my grandfather had planted 60 years ago. Buttercup snorted and stepped closer to the girl, as if sensing the danger that crackled in the air like static electricity before a storm. "The complainant alleges criminal trespass," Officer Martinez said, his hand resting on his radio. "Ma'am, this is private property belonging to the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. You need to come with us." Patricia's lips curved into a smile that could have frozen hell itself. "Officer, this child has been vandalizing our community property for weeks. I have photographs, witness statements, and a mountain of evidence that proves this family has been flagrantly violating our property rights." The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the disputed land that had been in my family for 4 generations. Emma's grandfather, my father, had built this ranch with his own hands after returning from Vietnam, turning 60 acres of scrubland into a sanctuary where wounded animals could heal and broken spirits could find peace. The irony wasn't lost on me that Patricia Harrington, who'd moved into the adjacent Meadowbrook Hills development just 2 years ago, now claimed ownership of land that had never belonged to anyone but us. I'd been preparing for court that morning, reviewing case files in my study, when I heard the commotion. As a district judge for the past 15 years, I'd seen every type of legal dispute imaginable, but nothing had prepared me for watching my own daughter being treated like a criminal for the simple act of grieving. The coffee mug in my hand shattered against the hardwood floor as I witnessed Patricia pointing an accusatory finger at Emma. "She's been feeding these animals without permission," Patricia continued, her voice rising with manufactured outrage. "Disturbing the peace, creating a public nuisance, and worst of all, teaching other children in our community that rules don't matter. This stops today." Officer Williams, the younger of the 2 policemen, shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, she's just a kid feeding horses. Are you sure this requires—" "Are you questioning my authority as HOA president?" Patricia's voice could have cut diamond. "I pay your salary through my property taxes. Officer Williams, I expect you to enforce the law, not coddle juvenile delinquents." Emma's shoulders shook as tears began to stream down her cheeks. She'd barely spoken since my father's funeral, finding solace only in the daily ritual of caring for the animals he'd loved so dearly. Buttercup, now 23 years old and arthritic, had been my father's favorite. Emma believed, and perhaps she was right, that as long as she maintained their routine, somehow a piece of her grandfather remained alive in this place. The sound of my boots hitting the porch steps echoed like gunshots as I emerged from the house. Patricia's expression shifted from triumph to confusion as she watched me approach, my judicial robe still draped over my arm from the morning's preparation. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying the authority that comes from 2 decades of legal practice, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Officer Martinez recognized me immediately. We'd worked together on numerous cases where I'd presided over domestic violence hearings. His face paled as the implications of the situation became clear. "Judge Morrison, sir, we received a complaint about trespassing on my property," I finished, pulling the deed from my jacket pocket. The paper crackled in the morning breeze as I unfolded it, revealing my father's signature from 1987 and the county seal that had never been disputed. "This ranch has been in my family since 1964. Every acre, every fence post, every blade of grass you're standing on belongs to me." Patricia's face flushed crimson, but her voice remained steady. "That's impossible. Our HOA purchased this land fair and square. I have documentation proving—" "What you have?" I interrupted, my judicial training keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. "Is a fraudulent claim to property you've never owned. What you've done is file a false police report, which is a Class B misdemeanor in the state." The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, broken only by Buttercup's gentle snorting and the distant sound of traffic from the highway. Officer Williams had already begun backing toward his cruiser, recognizing the quicksand nature of the situation he'd stumbled into. "Furthermore," I continued, stepping closer to Patricia until I could see the fear beginning to flicker behind her mask of authority, "filing false documents with the intent to claim ownership of someone else's property constitutes attempted fraud under State Statute 571.041, the penalties for which include up to 4 years in state prison." Emma had stopped crying, watching with fascination as the woman who'd terrorized her for weeks began to unravel like a cheap sweater. Patricia's perfectly manicured hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, her carefully constructed facade cracking under the weight of legal reality. "This isn't over," Patricia hissed, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more venom than her earlier shouting. "I run this community. I decide what happens here. You think because you wear a robe, you can intimidate me." "I think," I replied, folding the deed and returning it to my pocket, "that you've just confessed to conspiracy and attempted extortion in front of 2 police officers. Officers, I trust you'll be including Mrs. Harrington's statements in your incident report." The aftermath of that morning should have ended Patricia's campaign against my family, but it only marked the beginning of a war she was determined to wage regardless of the legal consequences. Over the following weeks, she escalated her attacks with the desperation of a cornered animal, each move more brazen and illegal than the last. She began by filing complaints with the county zoning board, claiming that our horses violated neighborhood ordinances. When those were dismissed due to our agricultural exemption, she contacted the state environmental agency, alleging that our well water was contaminating the local groundwater supply. Each complaint required hours of my time to refute, time stolen from both my judicial duties and my daughter's healing process. The real escalation came on a Thursday evening in October, when Emma and I returned from her therapy session to find Patricia's boyfriend, Rick Donovan, setting up surveyor's equipment on our front pasture. Rick was a hulking man with calloused hands and the kind of permanent scowl that suggested he'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with intimidation. "Excuse me," I called out, approaching the fence line where Rick was hammering stakes into the ground that my father had tilled 40 years earlier. "You're on private property." Rick straightened slowly, his 6'4" frame casting a shadow across the theodolite he'd been adjusting. "Not according to this survey," he replied, pulling a folded document from his back pocket. "This here's HOA land, bought and paid for. Patricia's got the paperwork to prove it." Emma gripped my hand tighter as Rick's voice carried across the distance between us, his tone suggesting that discussion was neither welcome nor necessary. The man had the look of someone accustomed to getting his way through sheer physical presence, a tactic that might work on his construction crews, but wouldn't intimidate a judge who'd spent 15 years dealing with criminals far more dangerous than a small-town bully. "That paperwork," I said, maintaining the same tone I used when addressing contempt of court, "is fraudulent. This property has been continuously owned by my family since 1964, and no sale has ever taken place." Rick's laugh was harsh and grating, like metal scraping against concrete. "Maybe you should check your facts, Judge. Patricia's got a deed signed by your daddy before he died. Looks like the old man needed cash more than he needed horses." The blood in my veins turned to ice water. My father had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia 2 years before his death, a fact that Patricia had somehow discovered despite our family's efforts to keep his condition private. The implications hit me like a physical blow if she had convinced him to sign documents during his decline. Proving they were signed under duress would require a lengthy legal battle that could drag on for years. "Show me the deed," I demanded, my voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority. Rick's grin widened as he produced a manila envelope from his truck. The document inside bore my father's signature, shaky but recognizable, dated just 3 months before his death. The sale price listed was $12,000, a fraction of the property's actual value, and the buyer was listed as Meadowbrook Hills Community Association, with Patricia Harrington as the authorized signatory. As you can see, Patricia's voice came from behind us, smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "Everything is perfectly legal. Your father sold this property to our community to ensure it would be properly maintained. I'm sure he wouldn't want his granddaughter trespassing on what's no longer family land." She'd approached so quietly that neither Emma nor I had heard her coming, a skill that suggested she'd had plenty of practice in sneaking up on her targets. Dressed in a navy blue power suit, with matching pumps that somehow remained spotless, despite walking across a muddy pasture, Patricia looked like a predator who'd finally cornered her prey. "The only problem with your story," I said, studying the document more carefully, "is that my father never had the legal authority to sell this property. This ranch is held in a family trust established in 1987 with me as the sole trustee following his death. Any sale would have required my signature, which this document clearly lacks." Patricia's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculating mind beneath her veneer of community leadership. Trusts can be complicated things, Judge Morrison. Sometimes people forget exactly what authority they have, especially when they're unwell. The implied threat hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. She was suggesting that she could claim my father had the authority to break the trust, perhaps even arguing that his dementia had returned him to a state where he could legally dispose of assets. It was a long shot legally, but one that could tie up the property in court for months or even years. "Emma," I said, never taking my eyes off Patricia, "go inside and call your Aunt Sarah. Tell her we need her here tonight." As my daughter hurried toward the house, Patricia stepped closer, lowering her voice to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Sitting up there in your courtroom, deciding other people's fates. But you're not in court now. Judge, you're in my world, and in my world, I make the rules." "Your world," I replied, matching her whisper, "is about to collide with the law. And in that collision, Mrs. Harrington, you're going to discover that there are consequences for fraud, extortion, and exploitation of the elderly." The confrontation might have escalated further, but the sound of car doors slamming announced the arrival of my sister Sarah, who served as the family attorney, followed by two more vehicles carrying neighbors who'd grown tired of Patricia's increasingly aggressive tactics. Word had spread through the rural community about the dispute, and farmers who'd known my father for decades weren't about to let his memory be dishonored by a suburban tyrant with delusions of authority. Rick gathered his surveying equipment with obvious reluctance, muttering curses under his breath as Patricia guided him toward their car. But as they prepared to leave, she turned back with a smile that promised this battle was far from over. "Enjoy your victory while you can. Judge," she called out, her voice carrying across the pasture where Buttercup grazed peacefully in the fading light. "Tomorrow is the monthly HOA meeting, and I think it's time our community learned exactly what kind of neighbor they're dealing with." The threat was clear. Patricia intended to use her position as HOA president to mobilize the neighborhood against us, turning what should have been a simple property dispute into a community-wide conflict. She had the advantage of controlling the narrative in a development where most residents had moved from urban areas and knew little about agricultural life or property rights. That evening, as Sarah and I reviewed the fraudulent deed by lamplight in my father's old study, the depth of Patricia's scheme became clear. The document wasn't just a simple forgery. It was part of an elaborate plan that included false environmental impact reports, bogus zoning variance applications, and a paper trail designed to legitimize the theft of our family's land. "She's been planning this for months," Sarah said, spreading the documents across the oak desk where our father had paid bills and signed Christmas cards for 40 years. "Look at these dates. She started filing preliminary paperwork before Dad even died." The realization hit like a physical blow. Patricia hadn't simply taken advantage of an opportunity when my father became ill. She'd been stalking our family, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The thought of her circling my dying father like a vulture made my stomach churn with rage and disgust. "There's more," Sarah continued, pulling out a folder labeled Community Development Initiative. "She's not just trying to steal our land. She's planning to develop it. Look at these architectural drawings." The plans were elaborate and expensive. A luxury shopping complex with upscale boutiques, a day spa, and gourmet restaurants. The project would generate millions in revenue while destroying every trace of the sanctuary my father had built for injured animals and traumatized veterans. Patricia's vision turned 60 acres of healing into a monument to greed and consumption. The HOA meeting tomorrow isn't just about us, I realized, studying the financial projections that showed Patricia stood to make hundreds of thousands in development fees. She's been selling this vision to the neighbors, convincing them that turning our ranch into a shopping center will increase their property values. Emma appeared in the doorway, still wearing her pajamas but unable to sleep with so much tension filling the house. "Dad, what's going to happen to Buttercup and the other horses?" The question cut through all the legal complexity to the heart of what we were really fighting for. This wasn't just about property rights or legal technicalities. It was about preserving a place where healing could happen, where a grieving child could find comfort in the simple act of feeding carrots to an old mare who missed her grandfather as much as she did. "Nothing's going to happen to them, sweetheart," I promised, pulling her onto my lap in the same chair where my father had told me bedtime stories 50 years earlier. "Tomorrow, we're going to make sure everyone understands exactly what kind of person Mrs. Harrington really is." The Meadowbrook Hills Community Center buzzed with anticipation the following evening as neighbors filed into the meeting room that smelled of industrial carpet and stale coffee. Patricia had clearly been busy in the 24 hours since our confrontation, as evidenced by the glossy brochures stacked on every chair and the professional presentation equipment she'd somehow acquired overnight. I arrived early with Emma and Sarah, choosing seats in the back row where we could observe without being immediately noticed. Patricia commanded the front of the room like a general addressing her troops. Her burgundy suit replaced by a softer blue ensemble that projected trustworthiness and community spirit. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia began, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to public speaking. "Tonight, we make a decision that will determine the future of our community. Do we allow our neighborhood to stagnate under the burden of agricultural nuisances, or do we embrace progress and prosperity?" The presentation was masterful in its manipulation. Patricia had taken photographs of our property from unflattering angles, highlighting mud puddles and worn fencing while ignoring the beauty of rolling pastures and ancient oak trees. She'd compiled noise complaints about roosters, crowing complaints that had never been filed with any official agency, and environmental concerns about manure runoff that contradicted decades of water quality testing. "The Morrison property," she continued, clicking to a slide that showed our ranch outlined in red, like a cancer on the map, "represents everything that's wrong with outdated land use policies. While we're working to build a community that attracts young families and increases property values, they're operating what amounts to an unlicensed animal sanctuary with no regard for zoning laws or neighborhood standards." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Patricia had done her homework, identifying exactly which fears would resonate with residents who'd invested their life savings in suburban dream homes. The specter of declining property values was a powerful motivator for people who viewed their houses as their primary financial asset. "But tonight," Patricia said, her voice rising with evangelical fervor, "I'm pleased to announce that we have a solution. The HOA has successfully acquired the Morrison property through legal purchase, and we're prepared to transform this eyesore into something that will benefit our entire community." The room erupted in applause as Patricia unveiled architectural renderings of her proposed shopping complex. The images were seductive clean lines, manicured landscaping, and happy families enjoying upscale retail experiences. She'd even included a small park area, though it bore no resemblance to the natural beauty she intended to destroy. "Property values will increase by an estimated 15 to 20%. Patricia continued, clicking through financial projections that painted a picture of suburban prosperity. "Tax revenue will help fund better schools and improved infrastructure. Most importantly, we'll finally have the kind of community amenities that match our standards and aspirations." Harold Brennan, a retired engineer who lived 3 houses down from the HOA entrance, raised his hand. "Patricia, this all sounds wonderful. But what about the horses? My grandchildren love visiting them when they come to stay." Patricia's smile never wavered, but her eyes flashed with annoyance at the interruption. "Harold, I understand that change can be difficult, but we have to think about what's best for the community as a whole. The animals will be relocated to appropriate facilities where they can receive proper care." "Relocated where?" asked Martha Singh, a veterinarian who'd recently moved to the neighborhood. "Most animal sanctuaries are already at capacity, and horses that age don't adapt well to new environments." "Dr. Singh," Patricia replied, her tone suggesting that such details were beneath consideration. "I'm sure suitable arrangements can be made. The important thing is that we're moving forward with a plan that benefits everyone." The dismissal of legitimate concerns about animal welfare revealed the callousness beneath Patricia's community-minded facade. She'd spent months crafting a presentation designed to generate excitement about potential profits while glossing over the real-world consequences of her scheme. Tom Bradley, a firefighter who'd known my father from their service days, stood up from his seat near the middle of the room. "I've got a question about this supposed purchase. Judge Morrison's family has owned that land for decades. When exactly did this sale take place?" Patricia's prepared response rolled off her tongue like honey. "Mr. Bradley, I appreciate your concern, but this is a private real estate transaction between consenting parties. The details are confidential, but I can assure you that everything has been handled legally and ethically. Confidential from whom? Tom pressed, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to asking hard questions during emergency situations. If the HOA purchased property with community funds, don't we have a right to know the terms of the deal? The question struck at the heart of Patricia's vulnerability. She'd been operating under the assumption that her authority as HOA president would insulate her from serious scrutiny. But Tom's question revealed that at least some residents weren't willing to blindly accept her version of events. The purchase was made with discretionary funds available to the board. Patricia replied, her voice becoming more clipped and defensive. The board voted unanimously to proceed with this acquisition as an investment in our community's future. What board vote? Martha Singh interjected. I've attended every meeting for the past year, and I don't remember any discussion about purchasing the Morrison property. The room's energy shifted as residents began to sense that something was amiss. Patricia had been counting on community apathy and trust in her leadership, but the presence of engaged neighbors who paid attention to HOA governance was disrupting her carefully orchestrated presentation. Some decisions, Patricia said, her smile becoming more forced by the moment, require immediate action to protect the community's interests. The board has the authority to act in such circumstances without lengthy public debate. That's not how our bylaws work, Tom replied, pulling out a folder from under his chair. I've got the original HOA charter right here, and it clearly states that any expenditure over $5,000 requires a full membership vote after 30 days' notice. Patricia's face flushed crimson as she realized that Tom had come prepared for exactly this confrontation. The firefighter's methodical nature, honed by years of emergency response training, had led him to research the legal foundation of her claims before the meeting. Mr. Bradley, Patricia snapped, her veneer of community leadership cracking like ice under pressure. I don't appreciate having my authority questioned by someone who clearly doesn't understand the complexities of community management. I understand fraud when I see it, Tom replied, his voice steady and calm. And what you're describing sounds a lot like misappropriation of HOA funds to purchase property that was never for sale in the first place. The moment had arrived for me to step forward. Rising from my seat in the back row, I felt the weight of 15 years on the bench as every eye in the room turned toward me. The recognition rippled through the crowd like a wave. Most residents knew of my position as district judge, even if they'd never seen me in person. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, my voice carrying the authority that comes from years of courtroom experience. I think it's time we discuss some facts that Mrs. Harrington has chosen to omit from her presentation. Patricia's face went ashen as she realized that her carefully orchestrated evening was about to become something very different. She'd been counting on my absence, perhaps assuming that I would avoid a public confrontation that could become awkward or embarrassing. Judge Morrison, she said, forcing her political smile back into place. How wonderful that you've decided to join us. I'm sure the community would love to hear your perspective on this exciting development opportunity. My perspective, I replied, walking slowly toward the front of the room while every resident tracked my movement, is that you've presented this community with a fraudulent document and misrepresented fundamental facts about property ownership, legal authority, and HOA governance. The silence in the room was complete, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. Patricia's political instincts warred with her growing panic as she realized that her elaborate scheme was unraveling in front of the very people she'd hoped to deceive. That's a serious accusation, Patricia said, her voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty she'd shown all evening. I hope you have evidence to support such inflammatory claims. I do, I replied, reaching into my jacket to withdraw the deed she'd presented the day before. This document, which you claim grants your HOA ownership of my family's property, contains multiple legal defects that render it completely invalid. I held up the deed so that everyone in the room could see it, though few would understand the legal technicalities that exposed its fraudulent nature. First, the property in question is held in a family trust established in 1987. My father, whose signature appears on this document, never had the legal authority to sell trust property without my consent as trustee. Martha Singh leaned forward in her chair, her veterinary training making her comfortable with complex documentation. What does that mean in practical terms? It means, I explained, maintaining eye contact with Patricia while addressing the room, that this deed is worthless. It's the equivalent of someone selling you the Brooklyn Bridge. They can take your money and give you a piece of paper, but they can't give you something they never owned. Patricia's hands trembled as she gripped the podium, her knuckles white with tension. Judge Morrison, I resent the implication that I would engage in any illegal activity. This purchase was made in good faith, with proper legal counsel and full documentation. What legal counsel? Tom Bradley interjected, his firefighter's instincts detecting the smoke that preceded a much larger fire. You just told us this was handled discreetly by the board. If you had lawyers involved, where are the legal opinions and title insurance documents? The question exposed another layer of Patricia's deception. Any legitimate real estate transaction would involve title companies, legal reviews, and insurance policies protecting against exactly the kind of defects I'd identified. Her inability to produce such documentation would be obvious to anyone with basic knowledge of property law. Furthermore, I continued, building momentum as Patricia's carefully constructed narrative collapsed, Mrs. Harrington's presentation contains fundamental misrepresentations about our property's impact on the community. We've operated under a valid agricultural exemption for over 30 years, with no environmental violations, noise complaints, or zoning infractions ever filed with any official agency. Harold Brennan raised his hand again, his engineer's mind working through the implications. Patricia, where did those photographs and complaint records come from? If there weren't any official reports, who documented these problems? Patricia's political training had prepared her for difficult questions, but not for the systematic dismantling of her entire presentation by people who understood how to research facts and verify claims. Her usual tactics of deflection and intimidation were useless against neighbors who refused to be bullied. The community has expressed concerns, Patricia said, her voice becoming shrill as her composure cracked. Not everything needs to be filed with government bureaucrats to be legitimate. People have the right to live in peace without being disturbed by agricultural operations that belong in rural areas, not suburban neighborhoods. Except, Tom Bradley replied, consulting his research folder. According to county records, the Morrison property was agricultural land long before this subdivision was built. The HOA covenants specifically acknowledge the existing agricultural use and waive any restrictions that might conflict with farming operations. The revelation stunned the room into silence. Patricia had been claiming that our ranch violated community standards when, in fact, the HOA's own founding documents explicitly protected our right to continue agricultural operations. Her entire legal theory was built on a foundation that had never existed. That's impossible, Patricia sputtered, her face cycling through shades of red and purple as the scope of her miscalculation became clear. I've read every document related to this community's governance. There's no such provision. Section 12, Paragraph 4. Tom read from the original charter. The association acknowledges that certain properties within the development boundaries pre-existed the formation of this community and operated under agricultural exemptions granted by the county. Such operations shall be permitted to continue without interference from association rules or regulations, provided they maintain compliance with applicable county and state laws. The legal language was clear and unambiguous. Not only did Patricia lack the authority to interfere with our agricultural operations, but the HOA's own governing documents explicitly prohibited such interference. Her campaign against our family had been illegal from the very beginning. Martha Singh stood up, her voice carrying the outrage of someone who'd discovered they'd been systematically lied to. Patricia, you've spent months telling us that the Morrison property was violating community standards. But, according to our own bylaws, they have every right to operate as they have been. Why would you misrepresent such basic facts? Patricia's response revealed the desperation of someone watching their carefully planned scheme collapse in real time. Dr. Singh, you clearly don't understand the complexities of community management. Sometimes leadership requires making difficult decisions that others aren't equipped to fully comprehend. The condescending tone was exactly the wrong approach for a room full of educated professionals who'd grown tired of being treated like children. Harold Brennan's engineering background, Tom Bradley's emergency response training, and Martha Singh's veterinary education had given them exactly the analytical skills needed to dissect Patricia's deceptions. "What I understand," Martha replied, her voice cutting through Patricia's bluster like a scalpel, "is that you've lied to this community about basic facts, misrepresented your authority to purchase property, and violated our own governing documents in pursuit of what appears to be a personal vendetta against a grieving family." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, impossible to ignore or explain away. Patricia had built her entire campaign on the assumption that her neighbors would accept her authority without question. But that assumption had proven catastrophically wrong. "I move that we remove Patricia Harrington as HOA president immediately," Tom Bradley said, his voice carrying the finality of someone accustomed to making life or death decisions under pressure. "And I further move that we contact the district attorney's office to investigate possible criminal charges related to fraud and misappropriation of community funds." The motion sent shockwaves through the room as residents realized that their HOA dispute had escalated into potential criminal territory. Patricia's face went white as the implications hit her. Not only was she facing the loss of her position and community standing, but she could be looking at actual jail time for her actions. "You can't do this," Patricia said, her voice cracking with panic as her carefully maintained composure finally shattered completely. "I've given everything to this community. I've worked tirelessly to improve property values and maintain standards. This is how you repay my dedication." "By holding you accountable for breaking the law," Harold Brennan replied, his engineer's precision cutting through Patricia's emotional manipulation. "Yes, that's exactly how we repay dishonesty and fraud." The vote was swift and decisive. 47 residents voted to remove Patricia as HOA president, with only 3 abstentions and 0 votes in support. The margin was so overwhelming that even Patricia's most loyal supporters abandoned her when faced with the evidence of her deceptions. As the meeting dispersed, neighbors approached me with apologies and expressions of support that revealed how thoroughly Patricia had poisoned the community atmosphere with her lies and manipulations. Many admitted they'd been uncomfortable with her increasingly aggressive tactics, but hadn't understood the full scope of her illegal activities. Patricia herself remained in the community center long after everyone else had left, sitting alone in the front row with her head in her hands. The sound of her sobbing echoed through the empty room as the weight of her actions finally penetrated the delusions that had driven her crusade against my family. The legal consequences came swiftly. Within a week, the district attorney's office filed charges of fraud, attempted theft by deception, and filing false documents with intent to deceive. The investigation revealed that Patricia had used HOA funds to pay for legal consultation about property acquisition without board approval, adding embezzlement to her growing list of criminal violations. More damaging still was the discovery that Patricia's development scheme wasn't her first attempt at illegal property acquisition. Investigators found evidence that she'd tried similar tactics against an elderly farmer in her previous community, though those charges had been dropped when the man died before the case went to trial. The trial took place 6 months later in my colleague's courtroom, as I'd recused myself due to my obvious conflict of interest. Patricia's defense attorney, a public defender assigned when she could no longer afford private counsel, argued that his client had genuinely believed she was acting in the community's best interests. The jury wasn't persuaded. The evidence of deliberate deception, fraudulent documentation, and systematic lying was overwhelming. Patricia was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 18 months in state prison, followed by 2 years of probation and full restitution to the HOA for the funds she'd misappropriated. But the most satisfying consequence wasn't legal. It was community-driven. Under new leadership, the HOA voted unanimously to establish a memorial garden on a small piece of land adjacent to our property boundary. The garden honored community members who'd served their country, with a special section dedicated to my father's memory and his work helping veterans readjust to civilian life. Emma helped design the memorial, working with landscape architects to create a space where both humans and animals could find peace. Buttercup, now 24 and moving more slowly, but still eager for her daily carrots, had become something of a neighborhood mascot as children, from the development visited regularly to help with feeding and grooming. The day we dedicated the memorial garden, 6 months after Patricia's conviction, the entire community gathered to celebrate healing and renewal. Tom Bradley spoke about the importance of vigilance in protecting democratic institutions, while Martha Singh discussed the therapeutic value of human-animal interactions for trauma recovery. Harold Brennan, who'd been elected as the new HOA president, presented Emma with a plaque recognizing her family's contribution to the community. The inscription read, "In honor of the Morrison family and their commitment to healing, service, and the belief that some things are more valuable than money." As the ceremony concluded and neighbors began to disperse, Emma and I walked back toward the house where my father had raised his family and where she was learning to process her grief in healthy ways. Buttercup followed along the fence line, her arthritis making each step careful but determined. "Dad," Emma said, as we reached the gate that separated our property from the memorial garden, "do you think Grandpa would have liked what we did?" I looked across the pasture, where 3 generations of my family had found peace. Then, at the garden, where children now played while their parents discussed community issues with respect and honesty. The transformation from Patricia's reign of fear and manipulation to this atmosphere of cooperation and mutual support had taken months of hard work by people who refused to let fear drive their decisions. "I think," I replied, watching as Buttercup nuzzled Emma's shoulder with the gentle patience that had made her my father's favorite. "He would have been proud that we stood up for what was right. And I think he would have loved knowing that his land is helping heal a community, just like it helped heal him when he came back from war." The evening sun cast long shadows across the pasture as Emma gave Buttercup one last carrot before heading inside to finish her homework. The daily ritual continued, but now it carried different meaning, not just grief and remembrance, but hope and renewal. Patricia's attempt to steal our land had failed spectacularly, but her actions had inadvertently created something more valuable than any shopping development could have provided. She'd forced a community to examine its values, to choose between fear and compassion, between greed and service. The choice they made had defined who they wanted to be. And in making that choice, they'd discovered that sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption and intimidation is simply refusing to be afraid. 6 months later, I received a letter from Patricia in prison. The handwriting was shaky, the tone contrite, but the words revealed a woman who still didn't fully understand the damage she'd caused. She apologized for the misunderstanding and hoped we could put this behind us when she was released. I never replied to the letter. Some lessons can only be learned through experience, and Patricia's experience of losing everything she'd worked to build was a consequence she'd have to process on her own terms. But I did frame the letter and hang it in my study, next to my father's military commendations and a photograph of Emma feeding Buttercup on the morning Patricia first called the police. It served as a reminder that the law isn't just about punishment. It's about protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit their vulnerability for personal gain. The memorial garden flourished in its first year, with children from the development volunteering to help maintain the plantings while learning about local history and agricultural practices. Emma, now 13 and more confident than she'd been since my father's death, had become an unofficial tour guide, explaining the different plants and their significance to visitors who came from other communities to see what cooperative spirit could accomplish. Tom Bradley, Harold Brennan, and Martha Singh had formed the core of a new HOA leadership team that emphasized transparency, community engagement, and respect for individual property rights. Their approach wasn't perfect. No human institution ever is, but it represented a fundamental shift from Patricia's authoritarian style to genuine democratic governance. The property values in Meadowbrook Hills had indeed increased, not because of a shopping development that would have destroyed the area's character, but because word had spread about a community that had faced a crisis and emerged stronger. Young families were drawn to a neighborhood where children could learn responsibility by caring for animals, and where adults demonstrated how to resolve conflicts through dialogue rather than intimidation. As I write this, 2 years after Patricia's conviction, Buttercup still greets Emma each morning with patient enthusiasm. The old mare is 25 now, ancient for a horse, but she seems determined to continue their ritual for as long as possible. Emma, now 14 and preparing for high school, has started volunteering at a therapeutic writing center, working with children who've experienced trauma. The cycle of healing continues, passed from my father to his granddaughter, and from her to other children who need to learn that kindness and consistency can overcome fear and loss. Patricia tried to break that cycle for her own profit, but she only succeeded in making it stronger. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment or revenge. Sometimes it's about protecting the space where healing can happen, defending the values that hold communities together, and ensuring that those who would exploit the vulnerable face consequences for their actions. Patricia Harrington learned that lesson the hard way. The rest of us learned it by watching her fall.